Slavery has its place in museums. I certainly think it's a worthwhile and important thing to take taxpayers' dollars and to create a museum about slavery, explain to people what was so terrible about slavery, how it worked, examine the past, even preserve artifacts related to that slavery. And in the same sense, it would be a wonderful thing if there were a museum in downtown Paris to the darkness of the Dark Ages. The Notre Dame Cathedral in downtown Paris, that's not its function. It's not asking those questions. And to pretend that it is would be like confusing a museum about the history of slavery with an actual ongoing slave trading market. You probably think that any progressive, right-minded person believes in the separation of church and state, but then that once religion is separate, that it just continues in perpetuity, unmolested, uncontrolled by the Constitution or government by any intervention. And that in this sense, the Notre Dame Cathedral and 100 other cathedrals should go on taking up a big part of the landscape, a big part of the geography of Paris and every city in France forever and ever and ever, and that they should take up a big part of the taxpayers' dollars forever and ever and ever, so that the gold is always shining on that reliquary, so that everything is maintained and restored. If you ever want positive cultural change, if you ever want to move past the legacy of the Dark Ages in Europe, then you have to believe in the government stepping in at some point and putting an end to exactly what the Notre Dame Cathedral represents and exactly what it really is. And it's terrifying for me to see Emmanuel Macron standing up without a word of criticism from anyone, not from the professional internet atheists, not from the left wing, not from the right wing, for him to stand up and say, no, everything should be rebuilt so that the Notre Dame Cathedral can remain a symbol of France forever and ever and ever. That's not the future of France. That's not the present of France, and that's not even the history of France since you wrote your constitution or since you wrote your first constitution in the French Revolution. The President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, has made public commitment after public commitment to rebuilding the Notre Dame Cathedral, a cathedral that recently burnt down in the middle of Paris. And it's surprising to me that nobody is questioning the constitutionality of this commitment. Nobody is questioning the moral or political significance of it in 2019. I had a quotation out from my father recently in which my father reflected, time of itself changes nothing. It is people in their actions, people in their deeds that make history. Time of itself does nothing at all. I'm somewhat horrified by the passive attitude of members of my generation that the future will come about of itself, that the future itself will bring enlightenment, that all of these terrible things from the medieval past, whether in Islam, recently resurgent in ISIS, the Islamic State, Taliban, and so forth, whether it's the medieval past of Islam or the medieval past of Catholicism and Christianity, that those things will fade away simply because the number on the calendar gets higher every year. And yes, I'm intensely aware of the irony that even the numbering of the years in our society is itself a memorial and a monument to Jesus Christ. Emmanuel Macron, the President of the French Republic, has committed his nation, in as much as it's his power to do so, or in as much as he can make the rhetorical claim, he's committed the nation to rebuilding the Notre Dame Cathedral because it's a monument to France, to what France is and should be. It's terrifying for me to imagine that people believe it. It's much more likely that people simply have this passive attitude that if the taxpayers pour their money into this monument, into this memorial to this religion, that as the centuries go by, somehow someone else will do the work of creating the secular society that the French Constitution promised them, that we don't have to bother ourselves about making that change. I often find myself saying to people, this is 2019. If we're not living in the future, who is? If we're not committed to make these changes here and now, what are we going to do? Wait centuries and centuries for some other generation to be enlightened enough, committed enough, motivated enough to make that change? At what point do we draw the line and say making excuses for the ignorance of the Dark Ages is over? Now, slavery has its place in museums. I certainly think it's a worthwhile and important thing to take taxpayers' dollars and to create a museum about slavery, explain to people what was so terrible about slavery, how it worked, examine the past, even preserve artifacts related to that slavery. And in the same sense, it would be a wonderful thing if there were a museum in downtown Paris to the darkness of the Dark Ages, explaining to you what was so terrible about the Catholic Church during the feudal period of our history, how it held us back from making progress for centuries and centuries, the bizarre and perverse ways in which that faith warped our perception of reality and made unbelievably cruel and heinous acts seem normal for centuries. That people were literally boiled to death in cauldrons in downtown cities, that people were tortured publicly and broken on the wheel for crimes that today are considered trivial. They might not even pay a fine. I remember one case of a young man being broken on the wheel for having stolen a stack of blank paper. And in a dynamic way, it absolutely is linked to the faith of Christianity. The same faith where their hero, their martyr, Jesus Christ, was himself executed by capital punishment, nevertheless became a social philosophy and legal system and society fixated on torturing people to death, torturing confessions of people and capital punishment. The way in which this faith that finds its seed in the New Testament, in the Bible, grew into a vine that suffocated all the creativity out of society, that people were persecuted and interrogated for heresy, for free thinking of any kind, for questioning church doctrine of any kind. The way in which the most absurd beliefs were inculcated into people as children and then enforced through very real violence for centuries and centuries. That's a story that a museum has to tell. That is not the story that the Cathedral of Notre Dame tells at downtown Paris. The Cathedral of Notre Dame, if you go to visit it, will not present to you the history of how absurd it is, how telling it is that people once believed that this piece of wood in a golden reliquary, that this piece of wood was a fragment of the one true cross, that people used to come on pilgrimages for what could only be called a hoax. Even if you were a true believing Christian today in 2019, but you were a somewhat rational Christian, you would have to recognize that the cult of the reliquary, of pretending that this piece of wood was actually the wood of the cross that a so-called historical Jesus was nailed to, and where the wood actually came from, and so on and so forth, the story behind how they found this and decided to put it in the church, the real history there, it's sickening. It's shameful. I think, if anything, you'd feel more ashamed if you were a true believing Christian and you had to look at that history and look at that legacy and feel that it's your history, that it's your legacy. Right? The Notre Dame Cathedral in downtown Paris, that's not its function. It's not asking those questions. And to pretend that it is would be like confusing a museum about the history of slavery with an actual ongoing slave trading market. Okay? The agenda of the Catholic Church and the purpose of that institution, with its multi-million-dollar budget in the middle of downtown Paris, is not to bring about enlightenment and the secular society that the French Revolution and the French Constitution are committed to. It is not clear to me to what extent Emmanuel Macron really knowingly and consciously and intentionally wants to throw away the separation of church and state that they have in France. And there's a very complex dance for how public funds get used to restore religious temples in France, given their constitutional history, going back to the French Revolution of 1789 and Napoleon and that whole story, that there is really supposed to be a secular government that is neither involved in building and beautifying and maintaining French churches, nor mosques, nor Hindu temples, nor any other religion's structure. They're supposed to be committed to this. But there's a broader problem here. My girlfriend asked me a couple of weeks ago what I thought in principle about the question of governments taking away land from private landowners. And I told her that time, this is something my own thinking has had to mature about over the years. Growing up in Canada, it's very easy to imagine that any time the state steps over the line and takes away private property ownership from people, that the state is doing a horrendous and criminal thing. Our history in Canada, the main memory we have, the main idea we have associated with the government taking away people's land is, of course, the government depriving Indigenous people of their land. Today, in Ontario, it's not the case that white people pay rent to a Cree or Ojibwe landowner. It's not Native people who are the wealthy landowners. Today in Montreal, you're not going to hear white people complaining that they have a Mohawk landlord. That's not what happened. In our country, the land was taken away from the people who owned it, and it changed the whole history of the country. In various places, it was cultural genocide or outright genocide. The history unfolds as it did. In Hawaii, it's actually a much more recent history that's very well documented of exactly how the American government decided to take away land from the indigenous people of Hawaii. And that's why it's very rare to have people in Hawaii tell you, that they're, the native people are becoming rich, that it's the indigenous people who are becoming multimillionaires out of the urbanization and tourism development in Hawaii. Okay? So that's our history. We have very negative associations with the concept of government intervening on private property and land ownership. Okay? Likewise, probably you watching this video, wherever you are, if you just think about government intervening in religion, it probably has negative connotations. You probably think that any progressive, right-minded person believes in the separation of church and state, but then that once religion is separate, that it just continues in perpetuity, unmolested, uncontrolled by the Constitution or government by any intervention. And that in this sense, the Notre Dame Cathedral and 100 other cathedrals should go on taking up a big part of the landscape, a big part of the geography of Paris and every city in France forever and ever and ever, and that they should take up a big part of the taxpayers' dollars forever and ever and ever, so that the gold is always shining on that reliquary, so that everything is maintained and restored. And look, guys, things burn down. This isn't something that's going to happen once. Today, it's the Notre Dame Cathedral. A couple years ago, one of the Queen's palaces, Queen's Ballroom in England, burned down. The Queen of England. There was this question, how many millions of dollars should be put into restoring this, and is it worth it? Cultural heritage, maintaining cultural heritage forever and ever doesn't mean just one fire or just one repair. Okay, the budget goes on forever and ever. But the problem is, if you believe in the principle that the government should never take land away from landowners, that means that you believe in aristocracy, and that aristocracy should go on forever and ever. In all these countries, in France, Germany, and so on, they have a history of aristocrats. And if the land wasn't taken away from aristocrats and given to other people, then the country absolutely could not make progress. Whether you're talking about Europe or Canada or Australia or anywhere else, you always have an ever-increasing dynamic of smaller and smaller numbers of people owning more and more of the land. And this is not new. It was already discussed at length and in depth by Aristotle. Aristotle in ancient Athens, they already had this problem. They observed it many times, and they observed that they needed government periodically to take land away from the rich and give it to the poor, or else democracy would degenerate into feudalism. A small number of aristocrats would own everything worth owning. A few powerful families would control the whole of Athens or Sparta or whatever the city might be. This is already known thousands of years ago, this pattern. So on the one hand, if you ever want positive cultural change, if you ever want to move past the legacy of the Dark Ages in Europe, then you have to believe in the government stepping in at some point and putting an end to exactly what the Notre Dame Cathedral represents and exactly what it really is. Now, that doesn't mean the Notre Dame Cathedral has to be replaced with a parking lot. The Notre Dame Cathedral could be replaced with a museum that really merits taxpayers' funding, taxpayers' dollars, that really explores and really examines what was wrong with the Dark Ages and the legacy of the church that built the Notre Dame Cathedral, examines why people went on these long pilgrimages to see this piece of wood that really is a kind of religious fraud that they imagined was, part of the cross that Jesus was hung on, and the crazy rationalizations they made up in their own minds for living in a society where people were constantly torturing one another to death in the name of this faith. A religion that was constantly at war with itself and constantly at war with the whole outside world, until one day in France there was a revolution. The people stood up and said no more, that the power of the church would come to an end. Okay? This is the problem. We're already living in 2019. When is the power of the church going to come to an end? In principle, it may sound evil to talk about the government taking away private property people, the government abrogating the right of private property. Talk about the government abrogating the rights of religion. What is the right of religion? What is the right of private property? If the right of private property is for the rich to get richer, is for aristocrats to own land in perpetuity, is for the class of people in each generation who happen to get wealthy to amass land ownership and then pass it on to their descendants forever and ever, uninterrupted, then you can just look at the situation we're in now and look ahead in the next 100 years and see very clearly what that will do to this society. Even if it's just at random that in each generation a few people become multimillionaires, what impact that will have. Okay? And what will be the change in the next 100 years if the accumulated wealth, the accumulated splendor even of the Catholic Church, if that never is abrogated, if that's never challenged, if that's never changed? And if it's not going to be the government, then who? It's not the case that Starbucks can ever buy the Notre Dame Cathedral. This is not a problem that the private sector can intervene in or change. It may sound cold, it may sound bleak, it may sound terrifying, but the burning down of the Notre Dame Cathedral is an opportunity for something positive to happen, for something better to replace it, for some kind of step forward, some kind of cultural and political change for France. And it's terrifying for me to see Emmanuel Macron standing up without a word of criticism from anyone, not from the professional internet atheists, not from the left wing, not from the right wing, for him to stand up and say, no, everything should be rebuilt exactly as it was, apparently at taxpayers' expense. That's not clear who's going to pay for it. That the money should be furnished so that the Notre Dame Cathedral can remain a symbol of France forever and ever and ever. That's not the future of France. That's not the present of France, and that's not even the history of France since you wrote your constitution, or since you wrote your first constitution in the French Revolution. That's a very sad and shameful thing. Look, guys, just to put this in perspective, you know what? What if there was a fire in Toronto that burned down the CN Tower? The CN Tower was once the tallest structure in the world. It's still in the world. What if there was a fire at random and they said, you know what, now it's not structurally sound. It would just cost millions of dollars to rebuild the CN Tower in downtown Toronto. CN Tower has none of these connotations. It's not linked to the history of slavery and feudalism and Christianity. It's not a piece of the one true cross for Catholics to worship. There's none of these issues, the church and state. You know what? I think the really mature thing would be for the people of Toronto to stand up and say, you know what? The CN Tower was a symbol of the city of Toronto for a certain period of time. You know what? Now that period of time is over. We can do better. We can do something new. We can have a new symbol, a new building. You know what? Let's let it go. Let's demolish it. Let's take it down. We can live without the CN Tower. The CN Tower is not really a symbol of the city of Toronto now, or what it's going to be, or what it's going to become. You know what? Let's have some detachment about what the CN Tower is supposed to be here. Okay? Might be hard to do, but I think that would actually be bold political leadership, and that would show. And again, you can propose something better. You can look at the millions and perhaps billions of dollars you'd need to rebuild the CN Tower. So you know what? We don't need to relive this ideal left over from the 1970s. You know what our city is all about. It can be something else. All right. But in this case, in France, the country that's committed to secularism, laïcité, to separation of church and state, what could be more saddening than hearing that the Notre Dame Cathedral is supposed to be the symbol for Paris, the symbol for France, for the French nation? Not 500 years ago and not 1,000 years ago, but now and in the future, forever and ever and ever, and at taxpayers' expense. This is the opposite of a commitment to positive progress. This is a commitment to stasis. And in 2019, apparently, there was just no public appetite for someone to stand up and make a better suggestion.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.